Hey guys, yesterday on my Instagram I posted a pretty negative review of this very famous book, Think and Grow Rich. And most of my review had to do with Napoleon Hill himself, the author, and the evidence that has come to light over many recent years that Napoleon Hill himself was basically a fraud. Now I knew this review was going to upset some people, got a bunch of messages, got a bunch of comments, and I feel you. I used this book to build my own life, and I took it basically as fact. And I do believe that most of his message is actually true. The problem is his story is not, and his character is highly dubious. Now there have been a bunch of articles about this, and there's a bunch of people who've made videos about this, but I'm going to share this video here by CoffeeZilla. I think he did a really good job, and he covered most of the main points that I have a problem with. And I don't need to remake the video if he's already done it. I will edit it up a little bit, and at the end of this, I will also give a more thorough rundown on his actual life story, because I can't really find an excellent video going through his actual history beyond just his claims in the book. I will also give a couple of more comments on what I do think was good and bad about his book.
This is sort of the Moby Dick of gurus. He's the big white whale that most people don't even know is lurking under the surface. He's influenced more business gurus than you could probably imagine. In fact, Tony Robbins, it's one of his top 5 books of all time. He's influenced Dan Locke.
Have you read the book?
Tai Lopez.
Have you read this book?
Bob Proctor.
You see, this is the first book I ever read. Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. I had never read a book before that.
Chances are, if you have a business guy you follow, he's read Napoleon Hill and he thinks he's the absolute Just listen to this YouTuber summarize sort of the popularized story of Napoleon Hill.
What's going on, guys? As many of you know, one of my favorite books in personal development is Think and Grow Rich. That book was catalyzed as a result of Napoleon Hill, the author, meeting Andrew Carnegie, who was the wealthiest man in the world at the time. Carnegie basically charged Napoleon Hill with interviewing a number of successful people, almost 200 people, and extracting the principles that allowed them to do their life's work.
All right, that's pretty amazing, actually. You have this guy who was broke at the time, Napoleon Hill, a journalist, apparently, who got allowed into the inner chambers of Andrew Carnegie for a long 3-hour interview, and he ends up basically committing Napoleon Hill with his most important work, passing down his knowledge. Napoleon Hill repeats the same story.
When I first heard Andrew Carnegie describe this natural law, which makes it possible for you and I and everyone else to write his own price tag in life and attain it, my search led me to the study of the spiritual forces with which all of us are blessed. And it was in this field that I came upon it and attained it while I was being coached by Andrew Carnegie during the organization of the Science of Success philosophy. I had just finished telling Mr. Carnegie that I feared he had chosen the wrong person to give the world the first practical philosophy of personal success because of my youth, my lack of education, and my lack of finances.
An incredible American story of somebody from a high billionaire business class reaching down and lifting someone up who is an unknown writer to pass on his greatest wisdom. Except it probably never happened. Okay, so why do I say that? How could I claim that this man whose entire life's work is built off of this incredible chance meeting with Andrew Carnegie and passing down all his information, how could I claim that he did not meet him? Well, for starters, they apparently met early in the 1900s, but he didn't start telling the story until after Andrew Carnegie died. He didn't share the story that they had met together. And the proof of Andrew Carnegie actually meeting with him? Well, apparently, he had all their letters together, but according to his own biographers, they got lost in a fire. There's absolutely no evidence that he ever met with Andrew Carnegie. Even if you believe that it was lost in a fire, we can compare Napoleon Hill's writings about Andrew Carnegie with Andrew Carnegie's own writing. In fact, Andrew Carnegie's own biographer doubts that they ever met at all. He says, "Let me put it this way. I found no evidence that the book was authentic." So this man built an entire career on this alleged meeting of the minds with Andrew Carnegie and all these wealthy people, but there's no proof of it, and Andrew Carnegie's own biographer says, yeah, it didn't happen. But guys, we can reach deeper than that. We don't have to simply rely on this guy's opinion. Who is he? Just the biographer of Andrew Carnegie. So we have 2 books we're going to look at. One is Napoleon Hill's account of his conversation with Andrew Carnegie. And 2, we're going to actually look at Andrew Carnegie's biography, and we're going to look at one of his little mini books called The Gospel of Wealth. See, Andrew Carnegie actually wrote a lot, despite what these ideas say, that Andrew Carnegie needed a reporter to transcribe all his ideas down. For a guy who was going to let someone else do the talking, he sure wrote a lot. So let's compare these two. In Napoleon Hill's account of Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie comes across like doesn't really feel bad for people who are poor, because really there's no injustice. Because just like the law of attraction states, which of course I think you guys should know by now is what Napoleon Hill came up with in Think and Grow Rich. If you guys don't know, that's what The Secret was based off of. That's where all this stuff is inspired by. But he says here, understand this truth and you will note that there's no injustice in connection with the difference between the fortunes which men accumulate. In other words, whether you're Andrew Carnegie or you're the guy working at McDonald's, you deserve what you get. They are where they are, and they are drawing the wages they receive solely because of the limitations they have set up in their own minds. In other words, look, everybody could be rich. Literally everybody. There's no problem with that. You just have to think about it. It's your mindset. Your mindset's bad. Have you heard of that? But according to Andrew Carnegie, who sounds much more like a businessman than a self-help guru in his own book, Gospel of Wealth, he says that competition naturally creates inequality. Under the law of competition, the employer of thousands is forced into the strictest economies, among which the rates paid to laborers figure prominently, and often there's friction between the employer and the employed, between capital and labor, between rich and poor. Sounds a little bit different, right? And wait a minute, that completely conflicts what Napoleon Hill says over here. I never set the wage scale of any man who works for me. That's supposedly Andrew Carnegie right there talking. Right there, you see that? But Andrew Carnegie, in his own book, laments the fact that he's forced to pay the strictest economies, basically the lowest possible rate for the most amount of work, which is how capitalism works. You want to pay as little as possible for the best amount of work, and then competition is formed for who you can hire based on that. Additionally, it is categorically false that Andrew Carnegie ever thought that everybody could just be rich by thinking that way. He thought instead, like a business person would think, that people who excelled at things of scale would inevitably make more money than people who didn't. In other words, if you can own the cloth factory, you can make more money than the person who sells the cloth or creates the cloth one by one. There must be great scope for the exercise of special ability in the merchant and in the manufacturer who has to conduct fairs on a great scale. That this talent for organization and management is rare among men is proved by the fact that it invariably secures enormous rewards for its possessors. In other words, either Andrew Carnegie completely changed his beliefs by the time he talked to Napoleon Hill and between when he wrote this book, or somebody's lying here. So what else do we know about Napoleon Hill that could push us one way or the other? Does he have a pattern of lying, or is he telling the truth? Well, I'll let you decide from some of his incredible stories. According to him, President Wilson, even though he was broke, decided he wanted to put old Napoleon Hill on the government payroll at a rather attractive salary. Now, how did he meet President Wilson? Well, apparently, of course, Andrew Carnegie really wanted them to meet. So they go ahead and they meet, but for once in my life, I had the privilege of vetoing the President of the United States. Now, he instead, though broke, made it essential he goes the extra mile without no thought of what he might receive for his services. In other words, he didn't charge the President of the United States a penny to work for him. This is all despite the fact that Napoleon Hill's life up to this point has been solely for the purpose of accumulating riches, but when it comes to the president, he doesn't want to impose. Other features of this incredible man's life is that apparently later on, after Woodrow Wilson had moved out of the White House, he got to know another president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Apparently, although his record of a real relationship proof is surprisingly scant, according to his biographers, but in conversations and in some of his papers, Hill sometimes claimed to have coined the historic remark, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," and claimed to have written a number of Roosevelt's fireside chats. That's right, guys. While not meeting with the billionaire business magnate Andrew Carnegie, he was busy consoling America and making sure that everyone felt okay by drafting the fireside chats. According to Napoleon Hill, he supplied the president with a steady stream of suggestions for topics, and fully aware of his own powers of persuasion, Hill was never bashful about supplying a script that would help the president make his point. Oh, The original fake guru. Guys, this man is claiming to have mentored 2 presidents. I mean, at this point, he's mentoring them. And he personally got self-selected by Andrew Carnegie to be plucked from poverty and to be suddenly made the #1 writer. What a lucky guy, I've got to say. As Wilson's suddenly deciding whether he should have an armistice for Germany, and Napoleon Hill's in the room. And the first person he read the decoded message to was, of course, Napoleon Hill. Woodrow Wilson's face turned white as snow. When he finished reading, he handed the document to Napoleon Hill. That's right. Top secret decoded information. Who do you give it to? Napoleon Hill. You leave it with that person. Apparently, the president was gone for 15 minutes. When he returned, he handed me a couple of sheets of paper on which he had written his reply to the Germans, which ended with 3 questions related to the terms of the armistice. After I read his reply, he asked if Napoleon Hill had any suggestions to add to it. Hey, Napoleon, would you like to help end World War I? Huh? Now, if all of this is starting to sound increasingly improbable, and it seems like the whole thing is made up, just wait. The story is just beginning. Because Napoleon Hill also faked being an attorney at law. I don't know if you guys can see that. He wrote that he's Napoleon Hill, attorney at law, Michigan Avenue. His own biographers, who at this point have found it credulous and included as fact that he has been an advisor to Woodrow Wilson and FDR, they call this a highly exaggerated claim, aka a lie. It's a lie. But all of this pales in comparison to the fake college that this man set up. That's right. Napoleon Hill not only started the fake testimonials, the fake mentorships, just lying about who you met, lying about their advice. He also coined something else. The original course, guys. This is, I'm serious. You guys know Think and Grow Rich, but you guys don't know the Automobile College of Washington, where he supposedly trained chauffeurs and car owners to drive and prepare mechanics to hold assembly line jobs in automobile plants. That's how his biographers talk about it. Now, and this is well borne out in the actual newspaper clippings that this man was the president of the Automobile College of Washington. But what his biographers coincidentally don't mention is this. Some guy wrote pointing the easy route to get rich quick land, which was an expose on Napoleon Hill. I'm not even lying. This man, during his life, was exposed for running a fake course. He got zillaed. Look at this, okay? I'll only read you the most important parts, okay? So they make fun of the fact that they call this the greatest school of expert automobile engineering in the United States. Does that not sound like a Caleb Maddox line? The greatest opportunity of our era? Literally nothing has changed.
And I really believe that the YTA method is the greatest opportunity of our era.
Additionally, this thing says, the catalog ought to be worth its weight in gold to the dyspeptic, for there's a good laugh on every page. Which is, old town speak for this guy is a clown. And they're talking about the Automobile College of Washington. Apparently, the whole scheme was a big plan to get free labor from college students. So you would pay in and they would get free labor. How it worked is you'd go into the school and while training you worked for them. You paid to be trained while you worked for them, and they had partnered with like an automobile manufacturer. And supposedly at the end, you were supposed to get this sales job where you could make, thousands of dollars. At the time, none of that was true. See, Napoleon Hill was also the first person to make big income claims. Our course prepares you to earn $4,800 a year or more. Briefly, the plan is all that those who attend and become a student of this college will get a job in this college. Become sales agents, guys. You can be a high-ticket closer for Napoleon Hill. See, he was the first one to do it right. This guy used the tactics that modern-day fake business gurus are using before it was ever a thing, and then he wrote their Bible. Are we really surprised? But wait, guys, there's more. Now, not only does Napoleon Hill do all of that, he also made it an MLM, this college. He says the very day you enroll, you may begin to send this to the names of young men who you think might be interested in our course. And you got commissions for it. And then he says, oh, you're going to pay for your course several times over in this manner. These people, back in the day, back in the 1900s, realized this guy was a con man. But through the power of just kind of whitewashing history little by little, people forget that these things exist. This man has managed to make a reputation for himself of being some genius in business. In reality, even by his biographer's account, who are super generous with him, who believe all his stupid claims, he was constantly broke, constantly in debt, even went to jail for a stock scheme, which is why he got arrested for blue sky stuff, which is an Illinois law about unlicensed securities, He was arrested and released. And do you know what his excuse was? Hill claimed that he was simply a forceful writer. So what? I say you're going to make $1 million. It's just aggressive marketing. People think he's some savant, some genius who talked to the great minds of America. But the truth is, they never knew him. They never heard of this guy. Napoleon Hill's Andrew Carnegie and the real Andrew Carnegie are two completely different people. One is some self-help person with a bunch of puff and fluff. The other is like a practical businessman who talks like a businessman, who understands competition, who understands market forces, who understands that not everything is just about your mindset, right? Millions of people have bought his books. Millions of people have bought into this idea that he was, some oracle of the rich and famous. But the truth is, when he died, most people suspect penniless. He had been bankrupt many times. He had been run out of towns. He said there was an attempted assassination on his life. Fraud, accusations of fraud. It all just follows the familiar path of our confidence men. They achieve a little bit of success because scams do. But ultimately, they're constantly undone by their own design. He was constantly spending too much money, spending more money than he could afford, chased by creditors. This man is not someone you want to look up to, even though on the outside, all that glitters is gold. The truth is that something was rotting at the heart of Napoleon Hill's story. I know that this might seem weird for me to say at the very end of all this, but I do think there's good things in Think and Grow Rich, about positive thinking, about goal setting. But the problem is that Think and Grow Rich takes it too far. It makes it into some gospel of success, that positive thinking is all that you need, that you don't need luck, that you don't need talent, that any person can just wish themselves into $1 trillion. And if you don't have that $1 trillion yet, well, you just must not be thinking about it enough. You must not be desiring it enough. That is completely ridiculous and leads to a toxic system of punishment for people who haven't achieved their dreams. So I'm not saying throw out your book of Think and Grow Rich. If you want to keep it, if it helps you, hey, I think that's fine. But you should know who Napoleon Hill was. You should know what the end of his life looked like, and you should know who he really talked to and who he really didn't.
Okay, let's dive more into this article that CoffeeZilla referenced. It's on Gizmodo.com, written by Matt Novak back in 2016. And I'm just going to read some of the more interesting excerpts from this article. And Novak tells a story where he's trying to contact the Napoleon Hill Foundation, and they really just didn't want to help him out. They didn't want to give him any information, which is a bit weird from someone with such a prominent history, supposedly. You would think that they would be open to sharing information about his life and the original documents involved. And Hill tried a number of businesses with varying degrees of legitimacy. He was an executive at a lumber company, he was part owner of a candy company, and he tried to be a magazine publisher as well. But it seems at every turn there was some kind of shady dealing that would cause his business ventures to crumble. And many of his business associates would supposedly take advantage of him by stealing tremendous amounts of money from Hill and then later pointing the finger at Hill as the thief. And at this point, I'm much more willing to believe that Hill himself was the thief. Novak points out that there are only so many times that a man can be arrested for the sale of unlicensed stock, altering checks, and outright theft before you have to question his official history. Napoleon himself apparently was a deeply troubled soul, suffering bouts of depression and loneliness as he struggled to become a financial success. Constantly on the move, he believed that success came through confidence and visualization. But behind every upbeat quote and promise of future riches, Hill had a darkness that could not be contained. Hill's early life is described as one of solitude and frustration after his mother died of an illness when he was just 9 years old. And the young Napoleon would regularly get into trouble with a pistol that he'd carry around the backwoods of Virginia at the tender age of 12. And his new stepmother told him, if you become as good with a typewriter as you are with that gun, you may become rich and famous and known throughout the world. So Napoleon started writing for a small weekly newsletter whose stories were sometimes picked up by small newspapers in Virginia. As Napoleon's biographers explain, Napoleon soon became a prolific source of stories. His writing was unpolished, if not crude, but he compensated with unbounded verve and vivid imagination. Indeed, he later recalled that when news was scarce and there weren't any stories to tell, he simply made them up. This knack for storytelling and outright deceit would come to define the life of Napoleon Hill, a young man who would embrace fakery as he strived to make his way in life through the sales of dreams. Napoleon Hill supporters are probably aware of 2 or 3 of his marriages. In fact, he was married at least 5 times. This would perhaps not be worth mentioning except for the circumstances surrounding his first 2 marriages, the 2 that are largely missing from the official stories of Hill. His first marriage occurred when he was just 15 and had gotten a girl pregnant, but not long after the wedding, Napoleon's bride confessed that he had not fathered her child. The marriage was annulled, and though it's unclear why this young girl would claim that the 15-year-old Napoleon was the father if this wasn't the case, nonetheless, it wouldn't be the last time that the official record of Hill's life would erase one of his alleged children. The official biography of Napoleon Hill more or less skips over the period covering 1903 until 1908. This is where he took the job as a sales manager at a lumberyard. And Novak thinks that the reason this period is omitted is because of his second marriage and his new daughter during this time. Napoleon's second marriage, which lasted 5 years, was filled with turmoil and violent outbursts. At one point, Napoleon took their young daughter without telling his wife, leaving the baby with Hill's mother in Virginia and threatening to never return her. And after a few months, Edith, his second wife, had gotten her baby back and filed for divorce, claiming that Napoleon was a man of violent and unforgivable temper, and that he treated both her and their child with disrespect and cruelty. This cruelty included periods of violence when Napoleon would allegedly throw the toddler on the floor and bed and proceeded to choke her. Edith also alleged that she was constantly under the threat of violence and that Napoleon had at least once threatened to kill her on a street in broad daylight, claiming he would blow her brains out. The testimony given at the divorce proceedings by Napoleon's former business associates and friends also outlined many incidents of infidelity with prostitutes. Hill apparently never showed up at court to contest the divorce, but in May of that year he was arrested for altering checks, though he was later acquitted of that charge. The more public fraud was his lumber business, the Acre Hill Lumber Company. Throughout that year, Hill had taken between $10,000 and $20,000 worth of lumber on credit from various suppliers as far away as Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. He had been selling off the lumber as quickly as he could in Alabama, accepting only cash and virtually any amount that he was offered. His business partner in this venture, who was either an accomplice to Hill's fraud or realized that something shady was going on, sold his entire stock in the company to Hill. And by the second half of 1908, word quickly spread that Hill was committing fraud, and every businessman in the lumber community was looking for him. In September of 1908, Hill went on the run. Warrants were issued for Hill's arrest in Alabama. The U.S. Postal Service was investigating Hill for mail fraud, and there was a record of at least one lawsuit filed against Hill in October 1908 by the Babcock Brothers Lumber Company in Indiana. Bankruptcy proceedings were filed in the U.S. District Court, although it's unclear how Hill evaded authorities. All we know for certain is that by December 1908, Hill had fled to Washington, D.C., ready to reinvent himself with a new name and a new backstory as an automobile expert, educator, and salesman extraordinaire. This is when Oliver Napoleon Hill would start introducing himself by his middle name, Napoleon. And this is the year where Napoleon Hill allegedly met Andrew Carnegie. Now, one of the other things that sheds dubious light on his meeting with Andrew Carnegie is that Carnegie supposedly gave him 17 principles of achievement. Novak puts it thus: imagine for a moment Andrew Carnegie, or any industrialist of the early 20th century, talking like that. 17 principles of achievement? That's the kind of strategy rarely found outside organizations that make it their business to sell advice. Carnegie was not known to be in that business, though his distant cousin Dale Carnegie would certainly get into it with his 1936 book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. In reality, 1908 was an incredibly tense time for Hill. He was recently divorced and hiding from a number of people to whom he owed money. And this is when Oliver transforms into Napoleon. Having fled Alabama, in Washington, D.C., Hill first joins the Automobile Club of Washington, and soon after starts the Automobile College of Washington, as president in 1909. And of course, his college was actually a way to get free labor for building cars. Students were paying for the pleasure of producing Washington brand cars for the Carter Motor Company, because the Carter Company had struck a deal with Hill's school and got free labor from the students who were toiling away constructing vehicles in a Washington warehouse. It was in DC that Hill met his third wife in 1910, a marriage which would produce 3 children. While Hill was honeymooning, his various business partners and suppliers were jumping ship. At least 2 partners in 2 different ventures had dissolved their business partnership with him in 1910. and one of them was alleging that Hill had stolen a car, a crime for which Hill was arrested and wanted. And this partner, Clarence J. Warnick, wanted the National Automobile College to be put into receivership. The Carter Car Company had to declare bankruptcy in early 1912, presumably because the people building its cars had no idea what they were doing, and former students who couldn't find work were alleging fraud. But Hill was not deterred. He continued the college, but it would no longer put an emphasis on teaching students to build cars. Instead, he'd teach people how to sell them. Now in 1912, his second child with his third marriage was born. It was a baby boy named Napoleon Blair Hill. Now this story is one that I really hope is not made up, because the story is that his son was born without ears, but the elder Napoleon Hill was determined to see his son succeed. He wouldn't let his son learn sign language. He was determined to single-handedly teach his deaf son to speak, and even to hear. And again, I could not confirm this, but apparently he did learn to hear, and then of course he was involved in one of the early attempts at a hearing aid, which was a mechanical device that helped him hear even better. Now in 1912, the Automobile College finally went bankrupt, and the Hill family moved in with his new wife's family, and Napoleon took a job at the Lumberport Gas Company. But he quickly grew restless and for whatever reason decided that he'd find his fortune in Chicago. In Chicago, his wife's family helped him get a job at the LaSalle Extension University, and at that university, he claimed that he was an attorney at law, which of course his biographers admit that this was an exaggerated claim and there is no record of his having actually performed legal services for anyone. It's unclear why Hill left LaSalle in less than a year, but by 1915, Hill went into business with 3 partners, buying a franchise of the Martha Washington Candy Company. They renamed their business the Betsy Ross Candy Shop, with Hill as president. And once again, for unknown reasons, these partners quickly pushed Hill out of the business. Hill would later write, "They had me arrested on a false charge and offered to settle out of court if I would turn over my interest in the company," though it is unclear what the false charge exactly was. Hill filed suit against his former partners and claimed to have won a victory in some Chicago court 5 years later. But this could not be confirmed outside of Hill's own writings. Following his brief dabbling in the candy business, Hill clearly believed that the way to riches was in establishing schools. And in September 1915, he started the George Washington Institute. And according to his biographers, where he got the capital for his venture is a mystery. But it likely came from yet another loan by his wife's wealthy family. Hill's unaccredited school in Chicago was set up to teach the principles of success and self-confidence. Perhaps too much self-confidence, as Hill urged his students to write numerous letters to newspapers in support of Napoleon Hill's, quote, race for a seat in the United States Congress, end quote. Later, some would claim that Hill privately aspired to nothing less than the presidency of the United States. Some of the students of the George Washington Institute would accuse Hill's unaccredited school of fraud, and it too had a very short life. Hill shows up in Chicago newspapers in February 1917 claiming that he's going to sue the Illinois Central Railroad because the lighting in their passenger cars was harming his eyesight. But we can't find evidence that Hill ever did bring a suit to the Illinois Central Railroad. By March of 1918, Hill's George Washington Institute was starting to draw negative attention from government regulators as a stock-selling scheme, as the Better Business Bureau put it. And the magazine Postage explained, while it appeared on the face of the operation that he sought students for educational courses he offered, there was evidence that his chief object was to sell stock in the enterprise. Hill had established the school with a capital valuation of $100,000, divided into 10,000 shares. He gave himself 51% of the stock and was selling shares to his students at $10 per share. The only problem was that Hill's $100,000 valuation was junk. The Chicago Daily Tribune says, investigation reveals that the physical properties and other assets of the Institute appear insufficient to warrant the $100,000 capitalization placed upon it. With just a few dozen desks, a mimeograph, and printing supplies, the school would be, quote, liberally appraised at $1,200, end quote. In June of 1918, warrants were issued for Hill's arrest. This is when he was charged with violating the Illinois Blue Sky Law. It didn't help Hill's case that he had set up the official-sounding dummy corporation called the First National Trust Association and was mailing students offers to lend the money for their tuition at the George Washington Institute, quote, to be repaid in installments at 5% interest, end quote. The name First National Trust Association sure sounded official, but it was just Hill ostensibly offering student loans at 5% interest to pay himself. When the warrants were issued on June 4th, Hill promised to turn himself in, but Hill wouldn't emerge until 4 days later, posting $2,000 bond. And this is when he defended himself by saying he was simply a forceful writer and that his business was in no way illegal. It's unclear whether he had to pay back any money to students of the George Washington Institute, But based on how quickly he shows up in newspapers with another scheme the following year, he clearly emerged relatively unscathed. All that said, by summer of 1918, Hill's third wife and her family had had enough. Napoleon was occasionally visiting his family in West Virginia during the lead up to his arrest, which was enough to get his third wife pregnant with their third child, but he spent most of this time during this period in Chicago, New York, and allegedly back to Washington, D.C. Instead of reporting the facts surrounding his administration of a fraudulent college, the official story of Napoleon Hill tells a different tale about his time from 1917 to 18 on the tail end of World War I. Many years later, Hill would claim that he was approached by President Woodrow Wilson for help with the war effort. And of course, apparently Wilson was willing to pay handsomely for Hill's services, but Napoleon wouldn't take any money from him. And even more curiously, Wilson didn't even have an idea for what Hill might do to help fight the war. He just wanted him involved. Now, Novak has found no evidence that Hill ever met Woodrow Wilson, let alone was in the White House during the negotiations of the armistice with Germany. And in fact, Hill's own published writings of the time don't mention this event at all. Instead, it's pretty clear what Hill was doing after the George Washington Institute was closed in Chicago in the summer of 1918. He started Hill's Golden Rule magazine, but its primary purpose seemed to be less about inspiring businessmen and more about helping companies swindle investors. And using this magazine, Napoleon helped a married couple spread news about just how well their oil company was doing. But the Federal Trade Commission charged Hill in October 1919 with using his magazine for fraudulent advertising. Specifically, they were referring to an article titled, "An Interesting Man and His Wife Who Have Made $1 million for Other People," which sounds like classic clickbait if you ask Novak. The FTC charges spelled out how the piece had numerous false and misleading statements, known by the respondents to be false and misleading, and published them for the purpose of furthering their plans and purposes. In other words, he was telling lies to get people to invest in the company, and he knew this. And there are some more shady publishing ventures in this time, including lying about charitable contributions, basically telling people that if they invested in these fraudulent companies, they would also be contributing to charity, and they were not. In the early 1920s, he was traveling from city to city to collect donations for his intra-wall correspondence school. He would hop from town to town, often targeting churches, promising that every penny he collected was going to help men in prison start a new life. But every penny was making its way into Hill and his associates' pockets by one way or another. One prison he was supposed to be giving money to was the Ohio Penitentiary, but the warden himself said that he never saw a dime of it. And neither had the prison Champlain, who had helped Hill start the intra-wall correspondence school in the first place. And of course, it was Hill who claimed that the Champlain and his associates were the ones who corrupted the Intra-Wall Institute's humanitarian mission. Hill blamed the lost cash on men of God, and much more shrewdly on the man he'd helped bail out of prison. That man's name was Stork. He was a check forger who was released from prison on Hill's recommendation to help start the school, but Stork was sent back to prison on Hill's accusation. And Stork changed his name on various occasions throughout the 1920s and would spend the next 2 decades in and out of prison for embezzlement and other sordid business deals. Now, in this period, one of the famous men that Hill was supposed to be associated with was Thomas Edison, who was of course one of the people Hill had claimed to have learned the secrets of success through. And they have this picture together. Now, apparently Hill got this photograph by giving Edison a medal. And when Hill circulated this picture of the two of them together, he used it basically to promote himself. And by one account, Thomas Edison actually returned the medal without comment. Now, I'm skipping over some details, but in 1926, it is said that Hill finally went into hiding for real rather than just running around the country. He'd stay in the backwoods of West Virginia, broke and alone, throughout 1927. But who Hill was hiding from is still unclear. Sometime in late 1927 or early 1928, Hill emerged from hiding with his 8-volume work, Law of Success, and he was determined to get it published one way or another. But Hill was completely broke, and yet he had to appear to his potential publisher, Pelton, as a man of success and grace. So he borrowed money from his brother-in-law, rented an enormous suite in a swanky Philadelphia hotel, and played the role of the successful businessman for Pelton. And it seemed to work. Law of Success was published, even though the critics of the time were very, very harsh on it, calling it somewhat mangled garbage. And if you've ever read Law of Success, it is basically gibberish compared to Think and Grow Rich. Nonetheless, royalties began to come in, however small. Now you might have noticed that Napoleon's third wife doesn't really appear in this story at all, and he had more or less abandoned her and their 3 sons by the late 1920s. All of them were living with her mother, and they only saw Napoleon when he'd peek his head in for short bursts, usually to get money. But of course, he promised that the money coming in from Law of Success would buy them a nice country home. And the success of this first book was actually his first legitimate success that allowed him to flaunt his money. He quickly bought a Rolls Royce, which he himself said was 2 Rolls Royces in a later book, and he bought an enormous house in the Catskill Mountains of New York, sitting on 600 acres. But whatever the true royalties from Law of Success were, they weren't really enough to cover his decadent lifestyle, and he sought investors for his gigantic estate, telling them that he was going to turn the property into the world's first university-sized success school. Eventually, they also intended to build and sell vacation homes on the grounds for successful people who wanted to mix traditional vacation pleasures with the opportunity to brush up on the principles that would enhance their continued success, his biographers would later write. And finally, in 1929, Napoleon's third wife and their 3 boys did move into the luxurious estate, which was the first time that all 5 members of this family were living under the same roof. But it wouldn't last very long. This was, of course, when the Great Depression happened, the Great Wall Street crash, and at first Napoleon seemed unaffected by the crippling downturn in the economy, but by mid-1930, their opulent home was foreclosed on, and his wife and their children were back in Lumberport, West Virginia, living with her family. Napoleon and his family were broke once again, and his wife's family was basically responsible once again for all of them. In the early part of the 1930s, Hill devised several different magazines and was constantly seeking investors. He was still jumping from city to city, though he had once again made Washington his home base, and started yet another success college called the International Success University, which, as Novak puts it, was a correspondence course that yet again was little more than a way to extract gobs of money from people around the country. Of course, during this time, 1933, he is said to have met President FDR, although outside of Hill's own writings, there is no evidence that he ever met Roosevelt, or wrote any of his speeches, or acted as a trusted advisor to him. In 1935, his third wife filed for divorce, and after this divorce, Hill found himself yet again penniless and lonely. He could no longer count on the money from his wife's family to keep him afloat, and he desperately wanted a companion. Now, he had been giving lectures for a number of years, and in one of these in Tennessee in 1936, he met his 4th wife, Rosa Lee Beeland, and she jumped at the chance to talk with Hill personally after the lecture. And apparently, there was a 5-hour meeting between the two, and before she left, they were engaged. Now, it was this 4th wife, Rosa Beeland, who would begin work on his most famous book, Think and Grow Rich. Together, without any money, the newlyweds moved in with one of Napoleon's sons, Blair, and his wife, Vera, in their small apartment. Blair was the only one of Hill's sons, supposedly, that would talk to him still. And it is said that Vera was the primary victim of the ill-tempered Napoleon in their cramped apartment. After a few months of verbal abuse from her father-in-law, Vera moved back to West Virginia and Blair followed. Before leaving for West Virginia, Napoleon's son Blair gave him and Rosa a $300 loan so that they could continue their work on Hill's latest book. According to Hill's biographers, Rosa was a tireless companion, editing Hill's thoughts into more coherent sentences. She worked day and night typing and arranging Hill's yet untitled manuscript, helping his thoughts flow and organizing them into something people could tolerate to read. And after at least 3 complete rewrites, they presented the work to Hill's former publisher, Andrew Pelton. So, his 4th wife practically wrote Think and Grow Rich, and if you have ever read anything else that Hill wrote, you can tell there is startling differences between the works. His own works are usually very rambling, incoherent, and repetitive, but Rosa seems to be the better author here. Now, Novak hovers for a minute on one of the weird concepts in Think and Grow Rich, and this is one thing that I think actually did come from Napoleon, which is the mystery of sex transmutation, as Hill explains that the desire for sex can be harnessed for getting what you want out of life. Now, this is one thing I highly disagree with. A lot of the principles in Think and Grow Rich I do agree with. Desire comes first, then a plan, then action. Your thoughts are important, although they are not everything. But this sex transmutation thing to me is gibberish. I don't believe it. Children can have ambition as well. Old people can have ambition. A woman with a hysterectomy or something, she can still have ambition and desire and have a plan and work that plan and gain success. It's not like your sexual desire is a key component of success. And honestly, in my opinion, having known quite a lot of actually very successful people, they seem to be the least interested in sex. They're more interested in success, right? So, it sounds like a horny teenager saying, utilize your sexual desires and put that into your efforts for becoming successful. And I always had a problem with that part of the book. Now, despite all of the shady dealings in Hill's life up to this point, Think and Grow Rich was and still is a smashing success, obviously. And people still in the midst of the Great Depression wanted to hear that there was a way out of poverty and despair. If only they would follow his steps of positive thinking, visualization, and hard work. And even though the book is founded on many lies, such as his associations with many famous people, the book's sales itself was at least an honest dollar earned. He didn't have to steal lumber anymore, or sell stock schemes dressed up as schools, and no more fake charities. But Napoleon and Rosalie Beeland had signed a prenup that would come back later to bite Napoleon. He signed over all royalty rights for Think and Grow Rich to Rosalie. And the idea was that all of the people that Hill had conned over the years couldn't come and demand their money back from Napoleon. And it was also a move to protect his royalties from going to at least one of his ex-wives, the one with 3 kids, Florence. Napoleon apparently went out and spent his money on flashy cars, expensive suits, and an enormous estate in Florida, while Rosalie indulged in the finest clothes and jewelry, and their estate employed a domestic staff to keep it all humming. But they were spending money faster than they were making it from the royalty checks of Think and Grow Rich. Now remember that Napoleon's son Blair had loaned him and Rosa $300 to continue work on Think and Grow Rich, but Napoleon didn't even repay him. And the once loyal Blair began calling his father, quote, unscrupulous, holier than thou, two-timing, double-crossing, good for nothing, end quote. And this was the last of his children that would talk to him. By early 1939, the Hills were yet again nearly broke. Rosalie was working on her own book, which would eventually be published in 1940, called How to Attract Men and Money, but the royalties from Think and Grow Rich weren't enough to keep the creditors at bay. Now, Napoleon and Rosa had this plan to adopt 15 children and raise them into perfect citizens during this time, but the income tax records only show 2 adopted dependents, and it is not at all clear what actually happened to them or how long they lived with the Hills. And it is speculated that this campaign about the adopted children was merely for publicity and some tax write-off. Now, this article is quite long, and I know this video is getting quite long, but there's even more bizarre things about them joining a cult in this time, and then once again selling bogus stocks and bogus companies. And in 1940, Rosalie filed for divorce. After the divorce, Napoleon actually went to his last wife, Florence, showed up at her door, asked for money, but she refused him. He went back to hopping from town to town, got married again for a 5th time to a woman named Annie Lou Norman, who had a small but substantial estate according to the official biography. And Hill continued to claim associations with famous people, even claiming that Gandhi had ordered copies of his book Think and Grow Rich. He continued speaking tours, he continued his efforts to offer educational courses, continued to launch magazines, and by 1955, at the age of 71, Napoleon Hill was tired. He gave his age to anyone who would ask as being in his early 60s, which is another lie. The remainder of Hill's time in the late 1950s is sketchy, but he pops up here and there giving speeches and trying to sell his courses. And he was promoting a new book, which was called Success Through a Positive Mental Attitude. Of course, nowhere near the catchy title of Think and Grow Rich, but basically the same thing, although more poorly written because he didn't have Rosa's help. And by the early 1960s, he was selling franchises of the Napoleon Hill Science of Success courses in kind of a multi-level marketing structure. But all of Hill's businesses continued to struggle, and like many other frauds that would come before him, he would get back into the charity game. Founded a non-profit Napoleon Hill Foundation in 1963, and this organization helped to create Hill's legacy and slowly but surely cement his reputation as a thought leader in certain business circles. Napoleon died in Greenville General Hospital in South Carolina on November 8, 1970. Now, he didn't exactly die alone. His 5th wife was there, but none of his children wanted anything to do with him. And apparently none of his former business associates wanted anything to do with him. And I don't know if you've noticed in this story, it doesn't seem like he really had any friends. Now, since his death, of course, a lot of this has been whitewashed over, and, he's this gargantuan figure that we all think his story is completely true. But as we've seen, his story is largely not true at all. His best work seems to have been written by his 4th wife, Rosa, and he seems to have been a guy that nobody really wanted anything to do with for very long. Now, I have said, I do appreciate many of the things in Think and Grow Rich. I studied it. I cannot even tell you how many times I've read it and listened to it, but I don't care for the lies. I feel ripped off, and I resent this man for making all this stuff up. Now, some of those truths have continued to be promoted in other self-help and personal development books, and I'm all about personal development, and I agree, again, the desire, the attitude, all this stuff is true, But there's also many of his dubious things that have been promoted as well. And really, if we're going to move forward in this genre of personal development, I think we need to completely scrap this. We cannot have our Bible being written by a fraud. We can take some of those principles that have been proven to be true over the years and we can promote them without promoting Hill or without promoting Think and Grow Rich. And once again, a lot of the people who talk about Think and Grow Rich, apparently they've never read his other books, and I have, and they suck. They're not good books. They're not enjoyable to read. They're gibberish. And those principles that are true, buried within it, you can find those in many, many other books. So for now, we've covered the story. I hope you look at Napoleon Hill differently. I hope you take his words not as gospel anymore. And I hope you also look at other authors with a grain of salt as well. And for now, you can let me know any other topics that you want to see covered here. I appreciate you guys. Until next time. And make sure to check out my channel for many other videos on a whole array of subjects. And my other channels are all in the description of this video. I'm very excited to announce my newest book, Everything the Government Does is Bad for Us. And you can get the paperback on Amazon for just $9.99. And you can find the video read-along version or the audiobook on my website, noticebooks.org. And all of my books, audiobooks, and links are available on my website, noticebooks.org. And if you want to see what is apparently my most controversial video that was banned from YouTube and BitChute, you can go to wagthedogtheory.com and view the whole uncensored version of the video. And I recommend downloading it if it is still there.